Okay. Well, terrific, Joanne. Thanks very much. One of the reasons I'm so disappointed that we aren't meeting in person is that I'd love to sit down with Phil, as I do most years, over lunch and explain to him that, in fact, inductive reasoning is not justificatory reasoning, and yet that doesn't threaten the scientific project at all. But I guess we'll have to leave that for for next year. So Phil, we'll sit down and talk about that next time we see each other. Our next session is a discussion, a conversation between Francis Widdowson and Stephen Perrott. Francis and Stephen are both longtime SAFS members and very active in SAFS. Both write frequently for the newsletter, as I'm sure most SAFS people are aware. Francis is a board member, and Stephen has worked on SAFS committees. Francis's new book, as I mentioned last night, Separate but Unequal: How Perilist Ideology Conceals Indigenous Dependency, is just out. And she's now working on advocacy studies and how they are having a detrimental effect on both academic values and effective policy development. Francis teaches at Mount Royal in the Department of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies. Stephen Perrott, for his part, is a psychology professor at Mount St. Vincent University here in Halifax. He also has a clinical practice. Their discussion will go under the title, make sure I have it right, Diversity, Inclusion, Equity, and Accessibility as Oath and Mantra. Stephen and Francis.
Thank you very much, Mark. Stephen, are you, you should get your video working. If you haven't, I can't see everyone on the list. Oh, maybe you're over on the other.
Yeah, I think Robert has me turned off.
I think you have your own. You have control over your own. I think if you go down to the
you
bottom,
should have control over your own. But
yeah, it's on the left-hand side of your screen.
Okay. I can ask. I asked you to turn it on.
Okay.
There we go.
Yes. Okay. So hopefully that's happening. I don't see everyone, unfortunately. With my, well, I can, but it's becoming a little bit confused with all the different people.
Steve, your head is cut off part of it. That's better. Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, because I can't see myself.
Yes, it's hard, and sometimes you change, and it's has another view when you do another segment. So anyway, I just wanted to introduce this. The idea here, which I was thinking of, which may work or may not work, is for me to play the Sam Harris role in this discussion. For people who are unaware of Sam Harris, he has a great podcast where he invites people onto his podcast, and they have a long conversation about some matter of interest that he personally has, and then the person he's talking to is kind of an expert in that area, and then he probes what they think about things, and from time to time puts in his own view. And I find it a very, very good format. So I'm hoping that's going to work. We'll see how it goes. I believe we have about an hour, Steve, is that right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. So we'll go for about an hour. Or no, we're gonna have question and answer, right? So maybe we should go for about half. Well, we won't go for more than half an hour. And then we'll open it up to questions, and we can discuss it with the audience. So, Steve, I'm very familiar with many of your thoughts. We've had a lot of discussions. And for people who are unaware of Steve's work, what we're going to be largely talking about today is an article that you wrote in the last SAFS newsletter, which was about diversity in terms of it's being an oath, being an oath and mantra. I believe those are the questions: diversity, inclusion, and equity as an oath and mantra at universities. So to start off with, I was wondering if you could explain what you think those words mean and why you think that they are an oath and mantra in universities.
Okay, I think the meaning of the individual words is probably less important than their overall impact on as a political branding, as a framework for understanding the particular zeitgeist we're in now. Actually, when I started to write this article, I thought I knew what diversity, inclusion, and equity all meant, and I had my views about it. And of course, I changed from a few years ago, thinking about this as kind of a motherhood statement, who could be against such things, to realizing the negative impact that this was having on the university and increasingly society as a whole. And then I tried to write this article and tried to define what these things were, and it was more challenging than what I thought. So to begin with, if you're to take these things separately, and they're rather nebulous, I think people would have trouble defining them. And one of the things that's happening with the so-called social justice movement is to manipulate language into new meanings or nebulous meanings. So one has to kind of determine what these things mean by how they're used. So in short, I mean, diversity obviously has got to do with diversity in terms of these rather superficial in some ways, but non-changeable demographic characteristics that Joanne Boucher talked about so elegantly in her talk, Identity Politics. So we're talking about sexuality, gender expression, gender identity, race, and sex in this intersectional hierarchy. And so what we're not talking about, of course, is diversity of viewpoint. In fact, the only viewpoints that are allowed in today's university become a very narrow view of what's become accepted. And I would say not at all just leftist views. I don't think that's the deal. One of our questioners last night talked about Karl Marx would roll over in his grave at having cultural Marxism applied to what we're seeing now as the zeitgeist. Certainly Martin Luther King, one suspects, would roll over in his grave if he saw his one race, the human race sort of thinking turn so much on its ear. Inclusion means, I think, that anybody who's considered disadvantaged enough, has enough oppression, and that can change in the intersectional hierarchy, because people like so-called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, who would have been, until 5 minutes ago, quite deep in the oppression hierarchy, are now being called fascists because they dare to say maybe there's something a little different between a person who is born male and identifies as female, and you can be as open and accepting of that as you could be, but to say that maybe that's not exactly the same as being born as a woman, I mean, that's known as hate speech and fascist commentary now. So the point of view from the hierarchy is that these people a group of people who were very much seen to be oppressed until about 5 minutes ago, and in need of, by some cases in need of protection, are now the villains. And Joanne talked about that a little while ago as well. So we have the situation of Jessica Yaniv on the West Coast in the Vancouver, Surrey, Burnaby area, going to immigrant women's households trying to get her male genitalia shaved. And finally, some people in the politically correct world decided enough and withdrew some support, but it took much longer than it should have had. So that's kind of the extreme of inclusion, is that where you end up on the oppression hierarchy determines whether you're allowed to say anything and whether your views are to have import. And finally, equity means many things, I suppose, but if you're going to sum it all up, it's got to do with equality of outcome, and to get there any way you can. And so we have a complete trashing of the merit principle. Not to say that there aren't problems with the merit principle. We don't all start at Go, and we can't get everybody at Go. But this reaction to everybody must enjoy the same outcomes, that's not feasible. But more than that, and I'll be quiet here, Francis, there's going to be question and answer, but more than that, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and my own university now has added accessibility on top of that. It's become kind of a mantra. It's become an oath that you must swear allegiance to. And so when you hear, for example, at various times, and especially over the last week, that we need to have some hard, critical, self-reflective talks on race, for example, no, we're not going to have critical, self-reflective talks on race. We're going to have talks on race as deemed appropriate by those who make the decisions.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the mantra that you have to pledge allegiance to, and all the things you see. For example, this week, university presidents taking the inappropriate political step of insisting that we all take political action in a certain way. I mean, completely inappropriate for a university environment,
Yes.
as Dr. Mercer said earlier.
Yes, and so, and that, I think that feeds into something that I just wanted to make a comment on, which was your discussion of inclusion, which I think also has this idea that you shouldn't say something which is going to be off-putting to a group that has been designated as one that is going to be meant to feel that they belong at a university. So I think that is part of it as well. You were sort of touching on that, but the idea is, and that's what I noticed at my own university with respect to the Mark Hecht case, which I is very, very intensely involved with, whereby people showed up to General Faculty's Council with posters saying, we belong here, racism does not. And the "we belong here" is the slogan of Mount Royal University. So the idea is that we, who is the we? So we is the groups that Mount Royal University wants them to feel that they're included, and therefore, in terms of ideas that make them feel that they're not included, should be suppressed. Is that have you seen that at your university? Like, how is this, and this is kind of an extension of what I was talking about. I can bring up lots of examples at Mount Royal University of how this is, kind of having this corrosive impact on the academic university. But at your university, which I believe is Mount St. Vincent University, what have you noticed in terms of how the effect that this is having on the university?
Well, I mean, it just shuts down any discussion. If somebody can claim that the ideas or thoughts are going to harm somebody in whatever group is so designated. And by the way, I should say that that most of the people who are claiming these very high levels of oppression, or at least a lot of them, we're not talking about the broad swath of people in society. So we're not really talking, for example, about you can't say that because it's oppressive to First Nations peoples. We're not talking about protecting, for the most part, most Indigenous people in this country. We're talking about protecting people who want to control the political agenda. And so many of the people who claim to be oppressed are actually, as Joanne said earlier, actually quite privileged, relatively so. And really the positioning of themselves as being oppressed is actually, in my view, a source of power in itself. And so,
sorry, Stephen, but something as well, just to add to your comment, Christina Bima, who we were having a discussion about self-censorship with, actually mentioned that it's often not even members of the groups themselves who are the most ardent kind of proponents of this kind of diversity, identity, and equity ideology. I was just thinking, and I'm not sure if this happened at Mount St. Vincent, but the hereditary chiefs, the support for the hereditary chiefs. which I think is a very good example, because people will know that there's a split in the Indigenous community as to whether it should be the hereditary chiefs or the elected chiefs who are the representatives of the Indigenous group. And some faculty members at my university, which caused a bit of an uproar, wrote a letter, expressing support for the hereditary chiefs. And they made it sound in their letter that it was actually Mount Royal University, faculty, student, staff at Mount Royal University who did that. But most of the people who signed that letter weren't even Indigenous. They were non-Indigenous people who were trying to show that they were in support of what was perceived to be the cause, the right cause. Is that part of it as well?
That's it. What you're talking about is the so-called group who frame themselves as allies. And again, they're only allies insofar as I don't want to say flavor of the week, because that's trite. But whoever is kind of in the greatest position of being oppressed, according to sometimes not the groups themselves, but the allies. So your example is a good one. The allies were completely prepared to discredit the elected chiefs in the name of these hereditary chiefs. And as you know, they said the elected chiefs were, after all, only the response or the result of the Indian Act, which was a colonial act in itself. The point is, whether that's got merit or not, the point is you're not going to argue or debate these things. And the scary thing is that the framing of many unpopular views in this zeitgeist as hate speech, that's pretty serious stuff. So hate speech, white supremacy, racial discrimination, bigotry, that's milder names, milder epithets. So hate speech becomes anything that you don't want to hear. And as increasing number of commentators are saying, we're having a lot of what are called hate facts. And so university professors, if they are so inclined, and there's still many so inclined, although that's changing, university professors cannot even go to their areas of expertise and report evidence as they understand it to be. That's increasing the problem. Just to say that you can't, for example, say there's such a thing as biological sex when, the history of the world has been on the dimorphism of our species.
Yes.
And to say there is such a thing is not to discount differences in gender identity or diversity, but things that were common sense to us all 5 minutes ago, all of a sudden, what we all know to be true is not allowed to be said.
Yes, and I want to get a little bit deeper into how this is happening. So there's kind of there's an understanding, I think, that professors have, and I can only really rely on my own experience, like how I feel. Is I start when we start to enter into a topic, and we were talking about this at the self-censorship panel, you start to feel inside of yourself. You can, if you're conscious of it, if you're going towards a topic that is kind of taboo, I guess, you just kind of back off from talking about it. So I'm just kind of thinking about the mechanisms through which this kind of feeling is beginning to manifest itself within professors at universities. How is this happening? Like, what is the evidence of these kinds of constraints? Where are they located? So that people can get a bit of a sense of where that is coming from and what it is. How come we do have these feelings? Where is this coming from?
Well, it's got to do with group conformity to a large extent, and divisions on these. Any deviation from the conventional wisdom on many of these topics doesn't put you in a position to be disagreed with or argued against. It puts you in a position of being a bad person. If you don't agree, you're a bad person, and you fall out of the realm of moral inclusion of the university community. And so, you know, we've got great examples of this with Jordan Peterson being excommunicated from the university, when probably most people and the majority of the population probably thought that he was speaking relatively in terms of basic common sense. But he, as you recall, there was nary a professor that stood in his defense, even though most of the things he said, well, all the things he said in terms of the hardcore psychology was completely evidence-based. And the things that he contends that are more philosophical in terms, well, then you disagree with them. But no, he became a bad person. One of the things that, just as an example, in the last week, I'm a police researcher. I've spent 30 years researching the police, and before that, 10 years as a police officer. And there certainly is racism in the police. There's certainly use of excessive force and brutality in cases. There's prejudice, there's problems everywhere. But I happen to know, as do others who weren't saying anything, that the very best evidence, empirical evidence we have, does not provide evidence that the police systematically shoot Black people at higher rates than white people when all variables are held constant. In fact, there's some trend in the other direction. And so at Harvard University a few years ago, a young rising star African-American, Roland Fryer, demonstrated this, and believing completely that he was going to find evidence of white on Black racism. And as he said, nobody was more surprised than him when he found out that wasn't the case. Well, I mean, he was quickly excommunicated and his results condemned. And they're about as good as we have right now in the world. Another good study came out last summer. But why should I, as a police expert, why should I be fearful of saying that? Because it means, I guess, that I'm not sympathetic to the situation of people of African descent in North America. Well, no, that's not true. I am sympathetic. Yes. But this is a fact, and it leads to more harm. It leads to, I think many police officers think that there is this systemic racism on their part because it's taken as such a given, but it's not true as far as I can tell, and one can't even raise that. So more and more people are being silenced. And it's not the big names like Jordan Peterson, it's people like me, for example, that have had a paper accepted in the Canadian Review of Social Policy, for example. I've got the email where it was accepted without equivocation, only to have it pulled when it was in press. My greatest sin, I think, was that I criticized critical theory, and somebody caught that after the fact. Turned down repeatedly on research funding for a little pocket of money after I'd been successful 7 times in a row with that kind of funding and brought the biggest grant ever to come into my university. But I was not to ask questions about rape culture.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that there is there are a couple of areas which I wanted to just bring into the conversation here, which I think could shed some light on this. The first is what Mark Mercer refers to as the culture of celebration, which is being fostered at Mount Royal University and other universities, which makes it difficult to bring up evidence and arguments which could potentially challenge this kind of celebratory type of framework. And just as an examples, what we're going to see now with, indigenization is the one that I'm most familiar with. Trans activism, you've mentioned, these kind of identity politics, largely identity politics types of issues. There's also, and so that's kind of one area that, and we talked about this with Sinclair McRae's talk, that universities are supposed to have some kind of scaffolding which allows for this process of disputation to unfold without some kind of penalty. And that's somehow disappearing or at least deteriorating in universities. And as well, the book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, The Modeling of the American Mind, they have an interesting section in there, which I was very, it really struck a chord with me, which was about witch hunts. And this is when there is a professor who has a view that is very controversial and outside of the norm, is a dissident position. I think Ricardo Duchenne is probably a very good example of this. And people are reluctant even to say that Duchenne should be able to put forth his position in a university, because you are afraid that you will immediately be labeled as a person who's a into white identity politics, which is basically what I believe Duchenne claims to be. And that personally happened to me when I defended Duchenne's right to put forth his arguments in a university, and I was immediately labeled being a sympathizer of his views by Matthew Sears from the University of New Brunswick. So that's kind of the fear of being, it's in witch hunts, the fear of being seen as a witch yourself by defending the person who's accused of being a witch. And this is all kinds of feeds into it. A couple, I just wanted to put these on the table. Administration's efforts to have this cultural celebration in various documents, and the thing that I'm pursuing quite a lot these days, faculty associations, which are sort of the areas which we hope will defend us if we get into some kind of difficulty with respect to a controversial idea. In many documents in faculty associations, you have support for diversity, inclusion, and equity, which are never defined. And so it's usually that definition that you were talking about earlier that comes to play. Anyway, I was wondering what if you had anything to sort of counter or discuss with respect to those areas.
No, and I always hate when people put out caveats about their positions, but I'm going to put out a caveat here anyhow. There's no question. We heard last night during the Fiority talk. There's no question. This kind of makes things somewhat more ironic that a lot of the pressure for freedom of speech and expression, in my lifetime at least, has come from the political left. And in much of the world, populist right-wing movements are really oppressing academic freedom. And so it's not like the right is not capable, for example, of identity politics. The right can be capable of identity politics. But that doesn't mean every time somebody disagrees with the fundamentalist leftist positions in university that they are part of that alt-right. I mean, Jordan Peterson is not alt-right. And so my concern is, talking to you, is not to deny that authoritarianism comes on both sides. In fact, I think it's very much the same thing, different manifestations on platforms, but the mindset is very much the same. No, I think that when you have the association of letting somebody express their views, as you talked about, being aligned with the fact that you must agree with them or you must support their views, I mean, it makes it very scary for somebody to put their heads up above the parapets. And, my view is that probably the majority of faculty, if you set aside like departments of sociology, faculties of education, and many of the humanities, in which there are many good faculty, by the way, but those are kind of the areas where identity politics reign supreme. I think there's still the majority of faculty in Canada who are privately concerned against this movements towards these authoritarian leftist views. But they won't speak up because we're conformists. We don't want to be shamed. We don't want to be thought of as bad. But what's going to happen very soon is that when people are being hired and they have to sign or they have to develop diversity statements to prove that they pledge allegiance to this particular ideology, what's going to happen very soon is that the majority of faculty will not be concerned about this authoritarianism. The majority of the faculty will be lined up with this viewpoint, which in many ways, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but in many ways is cult-like. It's just simply cult-like. And the real loser is society, because ultimately, when the public understands that universities are not at least trying to come to a closer approximation of the truth through this culture of Mark Mercer talks about culture of disputation, when the public comes to fully recognizing that the only things that university professors will say are approved statements, the only thing university professors can get funding for is approved topics where one signals that they will come up with the appropriate answers, which is not research at all, of course, it's advocacy, then universities serve no purpose. And, you know, up to maybe 7 or 8 years ago, there was some masking of the advocacy orientation that was emerging in universities. We talked about action research and so on. But the creep happened, and now people are no longer even feigning the idea that they're pursuing any sort of objectivity from a dispassionate position. The job of university professors is to promote a certain political view. What is the purpose of universities then? Increasingly, there is no purpose.
Yeah, so just to take you up on a few points, which I think we're going to get to a little bit more in the question and answer. I'm curious about your reference to left-wing, these left-wing people who are trying to impose their views on everyone. I find that the use of the word left in this context is I have some questions about, because I would argue that it's really postmodernism, which is a relativist philosophy, which actually is contrary to the idea of equality, economic equality. That's the whole thing of the postmodern identity politics is, you know, there are many left-wing academics who are opposed to identity politics since they think it is corrosive on the fundamental, you know, sort of conflict that exists within society, which is between those who are the producers of value and those that are the owners of what is called the means of production. And I think so that I think that's one thing that we can kind of flesh out a little bit in the question and answer. The final thing I want to mention, we should go to question and answer pretty soon. I'll just give you your final thoughts on this, which I've been thinking about quite a bit, is the rent-seeking aspect of diversity, inclusion, and equity types of initiatives, which is you're putting up a barrier to entry to other groups. So that, and this is why the equity part of this ideology is so disturbing, is because that just goes against the merit principle. But many people are now arguing for this because they are going to benefit. They are going to be the ones to get the jobs. And of course, administrators are very interested in the ideology because they use it for what's called tying in the rent-seeking literature, which is to tie academic programs to, you know, social types of benefits and ways to restructure society. So reconciliation is a very good example of that. That you, by hiring a number of Indigenous faculty members, the university will be seen as a supporter of Indigenous rights and be in favor of reconciliation. Those members of the Indigenous community will, of course, welcome this initiative because they will be the beneficiaries of the money that they receive for becoming a faculty member under those circumstances. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this rent-seeking
Well, there is rent seeking, and of course, the rent seeking doesn't help most people that are disadvantaged. It only helps a few elite. So your examples are well taken. My university is particularly far down this road because we're one of a handful of universities in Canada that have signed on with the federal government, officially taking on diversity, inclusion, and equity. So there are expectations about moving forward this political agenda, not moving forward an agenda of scholarship, moving forward this political agenda. And, when you see the whole diversity industry and the growth of administrators, equity, diversity administrators, harassment administrators, there's a lot of people doing very well from this setup, and perhaps they'll get to their retirements before the entire university implodes. But no, certainly there are, and for the rest of us who, if we wanted to be able to carry on any sort of a research program in this particular era, we're expected to pay rent. We're expected to develop questions and answers that meet with the zeitgeist. So we're seen as decent allies. Of course, we're always only ever this far away of being castigated to the garbage dumps of evil people. But we keep doing it. People keep trying to show that they are allies. And in the process, we throw away the pursuit of truth. We throw away objectivity. We throw away, most importantly, open expression and even ultimately freedom of thought. Because if you think that we could have gotten to where we are now, say even 6 or 7 years ago overnight, it couldn't have happened. Even to wimpy sheep-like university faculty, it wouldn't have happened. This had to be a march to get us to accept ever greater levels of lunacy. But then once you accept those levels of lunacy, and once you pay rent long enough, it's like paying protection to the mafia. It becomes normalized, and that's the only way you know about going about things.
Anyway, okay, well, and I just, one last comment. There is a whole bunch of literature on diversity managerialism, which is about all the bureaucracy, administrators. This is a huge area, so that's you did mention that, and I think that this is a major aspect as well. Okay, I think that it is time now to open it up to questions from the audience. Robert, I think I'll let you take over this now, and we'll happy to engage with whatever people want to talk about with respect to this area.
Thank you, Francis. Before we move to the questions, Sink had one about the study that came out last year. He just wanted to know what it was called, or if you could identify identify the study that came out last summer.
It was the Annals of. I can find it easily enough and send it to him if you can grab an email. Who was asking for it?
Sink McCrae was asking.
I will get it to Sink McCrae.
Okay,
I've got it on my laptop downloaded. I just can't remember the name of it right now. That one was one that dealt with officer characteristics. The one that from Harvard dealt with the whether or not blacks and whites were shot by the police disproportionately. The one that came out that I was just referring to, that I suddenly can't remember the name of, had to do with officer characteristics. Were white officers more likely to shoot than officers of color? And the answer was no. But I'll certainly get that article to Sink.
And we can make that available. We can make that available as well on the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship website, because I'm pretty sure many people would be interested in taking a look at that.
Thank you very much. So the first question is from Trevor, if he wanted to come on. Thank you.
There we go. How's it going? Thanks for the talk. That was a good discussion to witness. So kind of a question comment as usual. So first of all, I just want to say I don't know if either of you frequent Twitter, because if you're interested in where the cultural wars are being fought, that's literally the trenches. And one thing that I've noticed in my time, regrettably on Twitter, and I've been pulled aside actually before by my university and told that I can't have some of the views I've had on Twitter in an unofficial capacity. But yeah, I've been pulled aside before and told that I need to be careful with what I say on Twitter, which is kind of concerning to an American from the States originally. But anyhow, one thing that I've noticed is the claim to oppression that you hear all the time from different identity groups is currently probably the most powerful tool that you can wield in order to silence opposition and get your own way. And it's so powerful, I would argue, that I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy, James Lindsay. He did some work. Yep. Okay. Cool. Gonna explain who he is, but you know who he is. So anyhow, he's formulated. He's been working very tirelessly, maybe too tirelessly, over the last year on what he calls wokeism, which is the religion of social justice. And he was identifying. He's identified a lot of similarities between religion and the doctrine of social justice. So I guess that's not really a question. The question was, I guess, if you're familiar with his work. So maybe I'll just add one other thing. I'm actually looking right now, and it's funny that you'd mentioned this. I'm actually looking right now at a letter to the faculty from the president of the University of Regina, which is my institution, about standing in solidarity and Black Lives Matter and you belong here, racism doesn't, is our commitment to being a welcome institution for all, that sort of stuff. So just thought it was funny that you should mention that, because I got this letter 20 hours ago. So it's kind of spooky. You're in my head.
Yes. Yeah, well, this is happening. We're hopefully at SAFS we're going to be trying to tackle this a little bit, both in the newsletter and maybe letters to administration about doing this. But this has happened just at the University of Calgary. I just saw a letter about that. As well, at Mount Royal, I got sent some stuff, I guess it was yesterday, from the department, a particular department, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Mount Royal University, which sent out a letter, like an open letter type of thing, expressing their solidarity with Black Lives Matter and so on. I don't remember the exact words, but at the bottom of it, it was the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. There was not even any signatures that were on it. So you can imagine if you're a person, especially a contract faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Mount Royal University, you're going to be very leery about raising any, the things that Steve was talking about there. And I'm sure we can go and look into the studies that Steve was referencing there, and the methodology and so on. But you can get that feeling, that kind of clamp feeling, like, I'm not going to get into those studies, because then I'm going to be seen as a person who's not supportive of Black Lives Matter, and my department has taken a stand on it and so on. So this is happening everywhere, and it really, if someone who's an individual or even a group of individuals wants to put forward things, then that's their right. But why try to have this totalizing, position of the university, position of the department? That shouldn't be. That's just that is an attempt to be part of this, kind of narrowing of viewpoints at the university.
So, just to come back on that. Sorry, just come back. I mean, yes, I know James Lindsay's work. Of course, he was central in the big con that I thought was quite beauul getting stuff published, homoerotic dogs in dog parks. But just to come back to this, people like James Lindsay and one of his buddies, of course,
Bogosian.
yes. I mean, you can imagine what kind of opportunity you would have as a young academic to get a chance to get a smell at the lottery, which is a tenure track position. You have to pledge allegiance to this political doctrine. You have to keep doing it till you get reappointed in tenure. If you know that even if you have other views, that you need to get research funding and publish if you're going to move ahead. And I mean, the two things that are really striking, this is not very insightful, but the two things that are really striking to me, I remember 30 years ago leaving the police force. I used to be a police officer, and I was really turned on by the idea of multiple viewpoints and challenging my preconceptions. I can honestly say that I can change a police officer's mind. I can't change the mind of most university faculty that are entrenched in the social justice dogma. So it's just, and I just think I just forgot the other point I was going to make, but there's just no way that you can prosper. Oh yes, I know what I was going to say, and I believe this to be true, and maybe I worry too much. I am, as a tenured full professor, so I'm supposed to be, bulletproof at this point. As a tenured full professor, I can get away with being a sloth. I can get away with doing nothing. I can get away with being incompetent. But the one thing that I can get myself nailed with is running contrary to some of this social justice orthodoxy. Even what I'm saying today is likely to, bring wrath down upon me. So when a 63-year-old white guy is afraid of the wrath of this group, and I've got everything there is to get in the university, the full professorship and the whole bit, what would it be like for somebody in their 20s or 30s trying to make a go of it?
Well, that's where I'm at, exactly. I mean, I'm a freshly minted PhD, trying to get a postdoc in CS and pursuing a tenure track, hopefully tenure track position where I can do research and stuff, but also having the curse of having a conscience and being outspoken about my personal beliefs. But one thing that kind of disgusts me, though, I'm from northwestern Wisconsin. The closest metropolitan area to where I grew up was Minneapolis. And I've protested in the very streets that George Floyd was murdered. I have friends there who have had their neighborhoods razed to the ground. And I've had to watch them clean up and pick up the pieces. I call my little brother, who is just a stone's throw away. He can see Minneapolis burning from his house to make sure he's okay. And yet I'm supposed to be okay with people who live in, I don't know, an entirely different country telling me how I'm supposed to feel about things that actually affect me. And they're so distant from it, and yet they're the ones who have the altruistic, appropriate stance. It kind of pisses me off, for lack of a better word, and I try not to be emotional about those sort of things, but that actually does get to me. It's like, what the hell do you know about... Sorry,
not to interject, but we do have a number of questions on here, so I just wanted to move on to the next one. I did have a comment from John Palmer, one of our longtime members, who maybe many of you are longtime members, but he found diversity managerialism during the talk a great term. So I thought I should just mention that. The next person, we're moving on. We do have quite a few people that have requested to speak, so we'll try to move on a little bit faster. Henry is the next person who wanted to speak to this.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick. Thank you for the interesting discussion. And this is to Steve about your comments about the police. So I agree with you that, as far as I know and from my experiences in meeting police, is that they're really great and honest people. And also of course, you never know how real these data is, but I've seen some data recently about these shootings, and the data I saw was like 0.77% is white shooting black, and 58% is black shooting black. I mean, the numbers are just totally off. I mean, it's so amazing to hear constantly in the media these stories that I don't find any evidence for at all that I have looked. And what I wanted to point out, I don't know if you've seen recently this story out of Buffalo that 2 police officers were suspended for pushing a demonstrator. And then 75 other officers resigned. And unexpectedly, the original suspension was then reversed. And you mentioned Professor Peterson and the fact that very few professors stood with him. So I think SAFS, of course, does send out letters and stand with people in these types of situations. And I agree with you that it was really sad that nobody could organize a whole bunch of professors to stand with Peterson because so many did agree with him. So I'm not sure if there's a question there, but maybe you have a comment about it.
Well, yes. I mean, I think what I would add to that, I think you can cite things like black on black crime as maybe reflecting a bit of a hypocrisy, or we heard it from earlier speaker today, selectivity on what you focus on. But of course, you would also argue that it's not relevant to whether or not white officers are brutal and racist and so on. So I think, and I will send these articles around, I think that's the real question, you know, is there evidence of this racial profiling that goes on? Most of the research points to disproportionate outcomes, and that's true. The outcomes are disproportionately out of sync, but you have to consider the variables that feed into that. And I think from the point of view of academia, this is a hard question to answer. This is not an easy thing to do empirical research to tie these things down. And so what we have is as long as it's allowed, we have these occasional empirical studies coming out, you know, like this one from Harvard where this young black man was really roasted for publishing this work. It's going to be increasingly hard to get that money to do this good work. And then we have, on top of that, something called critical race theory. And I know critical theorists, I don't do justice to critical theory, but my view of critical theory is that you get to say whatever you want without any evidence whatsoever. And this stuff is published almost automatically. And so it's no wonder that the public has distorted views about how the world is. And so again, it's just a matter that universities is a place of seeking truth. I mean, that idea is pretty much gone. You know, my view was that seeking truth would in the end be the best way to really pursue real social justice. That was always my vision. But when you let your advocacy overtake your judgment and your critical thought, and there's nothing less critical than critical theory.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time for the questions, so I'm going to actually ask Stan, because I don't think Stan has asked a question before, and if he could ask his question or comment, and then we may go on to another if we have time.
I'll be quick if I can. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Bottom line is this. I was in the Canadian Army. I was at the Department of Justice. I had my PhD in genetics and plants. In my world, Monsanto is the good guy. I was an adjunct and a contract assistant professor at Ryerson and at Osgoode Hall. And I used to think everything you were saying, but I was afraid. I thought I was alone. I've listened to everything that was said here, and I've experienced it all, and I thought of it all, and I'm just, how can I put it? I feel good to have allies. I'm not some freak or some right-wing nut. And to give you one last shot, because time's running out, I'm not teaching it either anymore, but I'm 66, so it doesn't matter, I suppose. But I feel for the young academic, and I think it was Regina. But the bottom line is this. My last course at Osgood, I've been teaching there for some 16 years. A student told me to complain to the associate dean that I did not reflect the progressive values of Osgood, and therefore I shouldn't be allowed to teach. And I'm not anymore. And so I'm kind of going, it's quite an Orwellian poison that's going through the veins of the university. And I also have to agree, it's going to, at least in the long term, kill the concept of a university. That's my quick and dirty.
Yes. And just, I think there's a wide variety of ideologies that are being suppressed. I personally am a historical materialist, which is comes out of the Marxist tradition. But I am a pariah because identity politics says that Indigenous sovereignty needs to be accepted without question. And so there's all sorts of problems with identity politics and all these other things, which it's not like it's, I know people on the right are feeling that they're being punished and so on, but it is a huge range of people who just do not fit the very, very narrow demands of diversity, identity, and diversity, inclusion, and equity ideology, which is...
The associate dean at one of these universities told me, Stan, you can think whatever you want to think, just don't say it.
But if you don't say it, but what we say controls our thoughts. That's the real problem.
That was the advice I was given. He said, otherwise, Stan, forget about a late in life academic career.
Yeah, Stan, I thank you for your comments. I think that I hear this and I completely agree with you because I've seen it myself and I was not as vulnerable as you. But still, after all these years, it seems surreal that you cannot say what you believe to be true in a university. Mm. And again, I'm not against advocacy. I've done a lot of advocacy work over the years. I've worked overseas on development projects, the biggest part of my career. But scholarship has to come first because what is the point of the university? There's all kinds of agencies that can do advocacy. Universities only have one purpose, and we are throwing that purpose in the garbage can. We're in bad shape.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stan, for your question, the back and forth. I've been skipping. I'm afraid I've skipped over quite a few people because I'm trying to get different individuals asking questions than in the first round. So the next person on maybe the last, we'll see how much time is left, is Paul Johnson. Wanted to put forward a question for you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I just find this absolutely fascinating, this discussion. I'm a geoscientist at Mount Royal University. I teach paleontology. And I think many people would think that, the kinds of issues that we've heard about today and yesterday would fall, pretty squarely in the sort of humanities, sociology, and so on. And, science is somewhat exempt from kinds of issues, but in fact, this is not the case, especially if we want to talk about climate change. There's amazing parallels in the scientific community around discussions of climate change, parallels with the kinds of issues you've been talking about on other issues like diversity, inclusion, equity, and so on. And Steve's comment, if you don't agree with a kind of perceived consensus, you are a bad person. And there's some dramatic examples, I can tell you, in the whole field of climate science, climate change. And I won't go into detail here, but you might want to read about a professor at James Cook University, Peter Ridd, who was fired from James Cook University. He's a a geoscientist studying the Great Barrier Reef and questioned some of the claims from the Australian Institute of Marine Science around bleaching events and the alleged links to warming seas and so on, because of course geologists know that these kinds of events have happened innumerable times through history, geologic history. But yesterday at Mount Royal, we had a chat about, and a panel discussion organized by Francis, that we talked a little bit about some of the language now associated with different views of climate change. And you will note, if you look at the media in particular, that what used to be people identified as climate skeptics, which includes a lot of scientists, I know some of them personally, they are now climate deniers. We don't see the word skeptic much anymore. They're climate deniers, and that is such a loaded term. Because it implies that you're not just skeptical of ideas, you're denying an established truth. So I just wanted to bring this out, that this society should in no way be restricted simply to kind of social scientists and so on. This is very much relevant to scientific endeavors. I put up some posters advertising a talk by a visiting climate scientist from the University of Alabama, Roy Spencer, well published, and a journalist, Canadian journalist, Donna Laframboise, who's been critical of the IPCC reports. And wow, I got a lot of blowback. I got graffiti. Most of the posters I put up were torn down. And there was graffiti that was, on the few that did remain, linking that these people are like anti-vaxxers, and one of the problems that I see even, with SAFs is that somehow membership now is being construed as, you're somehow right wing. I've had this leveled at me that, okay, I've had some questions around actual, climate science data, legitimate science questions. I'm not a denier. I've actually never met a climate denier. I've met climate skeptics, but I've never met someone that said, I deny climate change. I haven't met one yet. But anyway, and then hanging around with Francis a lot at Mount Royal, raising questions about climate issues, and being a member of SAFs, people think I'm really right wing, which is completely the wrong interpretation. And I don't know how to shed that. I don't know if anybody else has that kind of problem. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I get that too, Paul. But I think the only way that you're going to be able to get through this is to come to recognize that geoscience is a deeply racist and colonial project. I think you've been getting communication on that of late.
Yes. And I think, I think the right wing label is a tactic, especially for people who find that to be very difficult to be smeared. Well, I consider it to be, an insult to me. Like, I don't know if insult is the right word, but I think it's completely erroneous in terms of its characterization of my views. And in fact, I think that I am to the left of all the indigenous rights, types of arguments. So I think that indigenous politics are right wing. That's what I think. And I'm criticizing the right wing character of indigenous politics. But to call me a right winger makes me like I get that kind of clamp feeling when that happens. And it's this kind of, and Orwell identified it. It was this idea that he had of a thought crime. He called it thought crime. And it's like you're thinking some thoughts which are not going to go over well, and it's hard to keep on thinking those thoughts if you're not allowed to speak about them. So now you're prevented from speaking about them, and so your thoughts will change, because it's just easier to live in a world where your speech and your thoughts are aligned. And this is the psychological kind of games that we're doing here. So what we need to do, and this is what we're doing today, and this is part of like why we want to have people like Samir Gandesha come and speak, because it's not a right-wing, left-wing thing here. It's people have different ideologies. We should come together, figure out what the differences are, and then maybe change our minds if we're mistaken. That should be the ideal, and that is really, really very difficult in the current university climate.
Can I point something out to Paul? Quickly. Paul, can you hear me?
Yep, I think so. I can hear you.
Yes.
About the word denier. I think the history of that is different. Actually, Al Gore is the first one who started that, and he actually used the word Holocaust denier. It was in an interview that he had, and then later on, people just started shortening it, and people forgot where it came from. So it's a lot worse than what you're saying.
I would like to actually do a little study. I'd probably need some kind of a journalist or media person to help me to actually trace the the origin and the increased prevalence of that. I think that would be a very interesting project. Good student project.
I